The hum of the chandelier above me shifted when I spotted my own photo on the venue's band guest list, placed there by my own son. Still, I kept my hand steady on the railing, refusing to let that trembling light expose the crack inside me. As the hum deepened, it echoed every year I'd mistaken distance for maturity in our relationship. While it vibrated through the hall, I saw how long he'd chosen shame over the father who raised him. The same flicker finally showed me the truth. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. That's when I decided, if my son erased me publicly, I'd restore myself with dignity he could never buy. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Harold Bennett was trimming the hedges outside his modest Virginia home when the phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost didn't answer. Most calls these days were telemarketers, but the name on the screen made him pause. Ruth Ann, his late wife's cousin. They hadn't spoken in months. Her voice came through bright, nervous, too cheerful to be natural. She said she was so excited for Ethan's big day. And Harold stood there confused, sweat gathering at his temple as she explained that the wedding was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She talked as if Harold already knew, as if an invitation had arrived long ago. And Harold, always polite, pretended for 20 seconds that he did, until the silence between her words pressed too heavily on his chest. He finally admitted he hadn't received anything. Ruth Ann stumbled over a few sentences, apologized in a rushed whisper, and then hung up as if she'd touched something burning. Harold set his trimmers down and walked slowly to the mailbox at the edge of his lawn. The small metal door creaked open with that familiar tired sound. Inside, a grocery flyer, a utility bill, and a coupon booklet addressed to current resident. Nothing with his son's name. Nothing with his own. Nothing that carried the weight an invitation should have. He sifted through the envelopes twice, then a third time, feeling foolish for hoping the outcome would magically change if he checked hard enough. When he finally closed the mailbox, the clank of metal echoed like a verdict. Inside the house, he hadn't even hung up his coat when his daughter Lucy called. No greeting, just her voice trembling with anger. "Dad, tell me you knew," she said. "Tell me you got your invitation." He asked what she meant, and she exhaled with frustration, explaining that she'd seen the seating chart on a wedding planner's tablet during a consultation. Rows and rows of names, the entire Thornton family, distant cousins Harold hadn't met, colleagues Ethan barely knew, and no Harold Bennett anywhere. She said she asked the planner twice if a parent table list was missing. The planner just shook her head. Harold tried to calm her. He reminded her that wedding lists got complicated, names moved around, sometimes drafts weren't final. He defended Ethan because that's what fathers do, even when the evidence claws at their heart. Lucy wasn't convinced. She said this wasn't a mistake, this was intentional. But Harold held firm, telling her not to jump to conclusions. After the call, he sat at the kitchen table scrolling through his son's online posts. That's when he saw them, Claire's pre-wedding photos. Perfect lighting, manicured vineyards, designer dresses, champagne flutes raised in curated celebration. Claire looked radiant. Ethan looked stiff, like he was smiling for a board meeting. Harold lingered on their faces, searching for warmth, for something that told him his son had simply forgotten, had been too busy, had meant to include him but got lost in wedding chaos. But the longer he stared, the more hollow that hope became. Still, he refused to surrender to fear. He typed out a gentle message. "Hey, son, haven't heard much about the wedding, just checking in. Proud of you. Call me when you can." He read it twice to make sure it didn't sound needy or accusatory. He wanted Ethan to feel supported, not pressured. He hit send. Minutes passed, then an hour. Evening settled in. Harold made coffee he didn't drink, paced the living room, checked his phone again and again. No reply, not even the small courtesy of a typing bubble. Outside, night thickened, washing the windows in blue shadow. Harold sat in his recliner, the same one where he'd once rocked Ethan to sleep during thunderstorms, and felt a quiet heaviness build in his chest. There was no single moment of realization, no dramatic shattering. It was slower, heavier, as if each minute of silence lowered another brick onto his heart. He tried to make excuses for his son. Maybe he's overwhelmed. Maybe he didn't see the message. Maybe the planner made a mistake. But the truth kept pushing through, cold and unwelcome. If Ethan had wanted his father there, Harold would know. A man doesn't forget the presence of the person who raised him. A son doesn't accidentally exclude his only remaining parent from the most important day of his life. The room felt smaller as Harold finally leaned back, closing his eyes. The air was still, too still. And in that quiet, painful clarity began to settle, an understanding he had resisted with every breath since Ruth Ann's phone call. His own son did not want him at his wedding. But what Harold didn't yet know, what no one at that wedding could have expected, was how far this first wound would push him, and how differently he would walk into that event when the day finally came. Lucy didn't knock. She never did when she was upset. Harold heard her car skid slightly on the gravel outside, heard the slam of the driver's door, and then the hurried footsteps across his porch. When the front door swung open, she stood there breathing hard, her cheeks flushed, her eyes wild with disbelief. Her phone was clutched in her hand like something dangerous she didn't want to touch. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking before she even finished the word. "You need to see this." Harold wiped his hands on a dish towel. He had been rinsing vegetables for dinner and stepped toward her slowly. She thrust the phone into his hands without explanation. On the screen was an email thread, forwarded multiple times, names blurred out but details unmistakable. A vendor document stamped with the wedding venue's logo, security protocols, guest lists, staff instructions. He frowned, confused. Then he scrolled and a bolded header caught his eye, ban list strict enforcement. He gave a small, weary chuckle. "Oh, come on, Lucy, this has got to be some mistake, probably a draft someone leaked just to gossip." But Lucy didn't smile, she didn't soften, she just whispered, "Keep going." Harold pinched the screen and zoomed in. At first it was a blur, then shapes formed, faces on a grid. 3 images. The first, a man with a history of drunken outbursts. The second, an ex-partner who had threatened the bride's family. And the third. He stopped breathing. It was him. A DMV-style headshot he didn't even remember taking, cropped poorly, slightly pixelated but unmistakable. Under it, in clean black text, were the words, "Do not allow entry under any circumstances." The world seemed to go quiet. The refrigerator hummed in the background, a sound he'd never noticed until now. Harold stared at the screen, unable to blink. For a moment he wasn't even angry, just hollow, stripped of something he didn't know could be taken. Lucy stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Dad, I'm so sorry. A planner sent this to another vendor by accident. It leaked in a group chat. I didn't think Ethan could ever." He lifted a hand gently, signaling her to stop, but his eyes stayed fixed on the screen. The words didn't change. They stayed sharp, plain, unforgiving, under any circumstances. He let out a short breath, one meant to sound amused, but that came out pained. "Looks like your brother really doesn't want me there," he said softly. "Dad, don't," Lucy whispered, and then the tears came. She tried to hold them back, turning her face away, but the apology broke out of her in pieces. "You didn't deserve this. You didn't do anything. Mom would have, she would have." She couldn't finish. Harold reached for her shoulder, but the movement felt slow, disconnected, like he was watching himself comfort her from somewhere outside his own body. The humiliation had sunk deeper than anger ever could. Anger was sharp, fast. But this was heavy. A dull ache settling behind his ribs, spreading like cold water, filling every corner of him. He imagined Ethan sitting with Claire and her parents, nodding as they decided this, agreeing, signing off on his father being treated like a threat, like a liability, like someone unworthy of stepping into the same room. He handed the phone back to Lucy with a steadiness he didn't feel. "It's all right," he said quietly. "He made his choice." "No," Lucy snapped through her tears. This isn't a choice. This is cruelty. This is them trying to erase you, Dad." Harold didn't argue. He didn't defend Ethan this time. Something inside him had shifted, something subtle but final. The invitation hadn't come, but this was worse. This was deliberate, calculated, signed and documented. Lucy wiped her eyes, shaking her head as if trying to make the image disappear. "We should tell people. We should call Ethan. We should." Harold straightened, the towel still in his hand, damp and wrinkled. His voice, when he spoke, carried a quiet resolve she hadn't heard before. "No," he said. "If they want me out." He looked toward the window, where the last traces of sunset brushed the sky in soft gold. "Then I'll walk in on my terms." Lucy stared at him, confusion mixing with the last remnants of her frustration. "What does that mean?" Harold didn't answer, not yet. He didn't know the full shape of it himself, only that the humiliation he felt now would not be the final chapter, not the image his son carried of him, not the legacy he allowed to define them. He folded the towel carefully, set it on the counter, and exhaled as though letting something old finally leave his body. Whatever came next, Ethan and Claire would not see it coming. And the wedding, their wedding, would not unfold the way they imagined. Harold didn't sleep much the night after Lucy showed him the band guest document. He lay awake in the stillness of his house, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant hiss of passing cars. His mind kept circling the same truth. Ethan hadn't drifted away overnight. This exclusion wasn't spontaneous. It had history behind it, history Harold had been too hopeful, too forgiving to confront. Around 3 in the morning, as the sky took on its first pale hint of blue, an old memory rose with painful clarity. It was 4 years earlier. Ethan had just landed a promotion at his corporate firm. He had come to Harold's house wearing a tailored suit and a bright, almost feverish excitement. He talked about keeping up appearances, about how his colleagues all lived in high-rise apartments with concierge service and luxury gyms. He said he needed to upgrade, needed to align with the lifestyle expected of him. When Harold asked what that meant, Ethan hesitated, then came out with it. A request for a massive loan. Not for necessity, not for a crisis, just to afford a lifestyle he thought would help him rise faster. Harold remembered the moment with aching precision. He had sat across from his son, coffee growing cold between them, trying to explain gently that he couldn't and wouldn't fund image chasing. That debt for showmanship wasn't the life he wanted for Ethan. That a man's worth wasn't measured by skylines or leather couches. Ethan had nodded, but something in his eyes cooled, like a door drifting shut. Then Claire entered the picture. Harold recalled the first dinner with her family, the Thorntons with their immaculate posture and tight, polite smiles, the way they spoke down to him without ever raising their voices. Eleanor Thornton, Claire's mother, had made comments wrapped in sugar and superiority. She complimented Harold's hands-on career, then followed it with a remark about rougher upbringings and learning refinement later in life. A dagger delivered in lace. But the worst part had been Ethan's behavior. He laughed at their jokes about blue-collar charm, oblivious or unwilling to see the humiliation crossing his father's face. Each visit after that grew colder, shorter. Calls went unanswered. Holidays became obligations. And slowly, without announcement, his son's loyalty shifted toward a family who saw Harold as a blemish on their curated image. Now, staring at the ceiling in the early morning light, Harold realized the banning wasn't sudden cruelty. It was a long echo of choices Ethan had been making for years. By mid-afternoon, Harold found himself driving toward the wedding venue. He didn't fully know why. Curiosity, maybe, or a need to face the place that would host a celebration he was forbidden to witness. The Thornton estate chosen for the wedding sat atop a gentle hill, surrounded by manicured hedges and stone fountains spraying ribbons of water into the air. Everything gleamed with wealth and careful design, the kind of beauty that didn't welcome imperfection. Harold parked a block away and approached on foot, blending with the steady bustle of vendors setting up for the weekend's rehearsals. He stopped just across the street, hands in his pockets, watching quietly. Security teams moved around the entrance, walking their routes with crisp precision. He recognized one of the companies listed on the leaked document. The guards carried clipboards and checklists, flipping pages as they practiced entry screenings. And then, an image caught his eye. His own face. There it was again, printed clearly, clipped to the corner of a List 1 guard held up for the others. The guard tapped the photo, saying something Harold couldn't hear, and the group nodded with the mechanical professionalism of people trained to follow orders. Harold felt something inside him fracture, not the sharp break of anger, but a deeper, quieter splitting. To stand across the street from his son's wedding, watching strangers hold up his picture as if he were a threat, it was a kind of erasure he hadn't known a father could feel. As if his existence had been edited out of his own family narrative with a few strokes on an event coordinator's email. He stood there a long moment, letting the ache settle, letting the humiliation do what it would. But then, slowly, a different expression formed on his face. A small, deliberate smile. Because these people, Claire, her mother, the venue staff, even Ethan, believed they understood his world. They believed they could lock him out, box him in, reduce him to a photo on a piece of paper. But they did. And know the full story of his life. They didn't know the men and women he had pulled from burning buildings, the friends who owed him their lives, the connections forged not from money but from honor, loyalty, and survival. They didn't know who still answered his call. Harold turned from the venue with a calmness that surprised even him. The wound was still there, but something else now pressed beneath it, something steady, intentional. This wasn't over. And when the wedding day came, he would not be standing across the street. The following morning, Harold sat at his kitchen table staring at the vendor sheet he had printed the night before. One name circled in red ink, Price Tactical Services, the security firm contracted for the wedding. He hadn't circled it out of anger. It was instinct, an old firefighter's instinct that told him if you want to understand a fire, you talk to the people closest to the heat. By late afternoon, he was standing in front of a modern, glass-fronted building tucked between two warehouses on the edge of town. The air smelled faintly of asphalt and engine oil. Inside, the lobby was sleek and industrial, the kind of place built for efficiency rather than comfort. A receptionist looked up, ready to ask questions, but before she could speak, a door swung open down the hall. A tall man in a charcoal tactical uniform stepped out, pausing mid-sentence when he saw Harold. His eyes widened with sudden recognition. "No way," the man breathed. "Harold Bennett." Harold blinked, puzzled, until the man strode forward with a grin that didn't match the severity of his uniform. "You don't remember me, do you?" he said. "Mason Price, Station 14. You dragged me out of that warehouse fire back in '09. And suddenly it clicked, the collapsing beams, the suffocating darkness, the terrified voice shouting from behind a wall of smoke. Harold had carried that young firefighter out on his shoulders, coughing, barely conscious. Now here he stood, older, scarred, but alive. "Mason," Harold murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "You were just a kid back then." Mason laughed once, a sound filled with gratitude. "A kid who wouldn't be here without you. Come on back. Whatever brought you here, we'll talk." He led Harold to a modest office overlooking the warehouse floor where men and women in uniform practiced drills with quiet precision. Mason shut the door behind them, his smile fading into something more serious. "So," he said gently, "what's going on?" Harold pulled the folded vendor sheet from his pocket and placed it on the desk. Mason scanned it quickly, his jaw tightening. "Thornton wedding," he muttered. "Big contract, big egos." Harold hesitated, then spoke plainly. "I saw my photo on a band list." Mason didn't look surprised. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping the armrest. "You want the truth?" Harold nodded. Mason turned to his computer, clicked through several secure folders, then swiveled the monitor so Harold could see. It was the same band guest list, cleaner, internal, higher resolution. And there, under the section labeled High Priority Restriction, was Harold's face again. But this time, a name was attached to the request. Requested by Ethan Bennett. Harold didn't move, didn't speak. His throat tightened, but no sound came out. Seeing his picture on the list had been painful enough, but seeing his son's name beside it, there was no preparing for that. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was Claire's influence alone. Ethan had made the choice himself, signed it, approved it. Mason watched him with quiet sympathy. "I'm sorry, Harold. I wanted to believe it was the planner or the bride's family, but this came directly from your son." Harold's fingers curled against the edge of the desk. He didn't lash out, didn't curse, didn't even sigh. But the silence he held was heavy, the kind that only comes when a man's heart cracks in a place he spent years protecting. "For what it's worth," Mason said softly, "my team doesn't like lists like this. Family bands, those are dirty work, but we're under contract. We enforce what we're told." Harold nodded, his voice nearly a whisper. "I understand." Mason studied him for a long beat, then sat forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Listen, I owe you my life. That's not a small thing. And I can't break the law, can't violate contract terms, but I can tell you what's public, what's procedural, what anyone could learn if they asked the right questions." He pulled out a folder and slid it toward Harold. Inside were logistical notes, staffing details, basic ground rules, information that wasn't classified but not exactly easy to obtain without knowing someone on the inside. "This is all above board," Mason said firmly, "but it gives you a picture of how things will run that day." Harold didn't touch the folder at first. He just stared at it, absorbing the meaning behind the gesture. Gratitude, loyalty, something his own son had forgotten. Finally, He lifted it slowly. "Thank you, Mason." Mason stood, his expression a mix of respect and anger on Harold's behalf. "Harold, if you ever need support, you call me. I don't care if it's that day or 10 years from now. You hear me?" Harold met his eyes, the folder in his hand feeling heavier than paper alone. "I hear you." He stepped out of the office and into the fading light of the warehouse, carrying with him not just the confirmation of his son's betrayal, but the first real spark of what his next move might be. Harold never intended to attend the charity gala. Lucy had bought the tickets months ago, insisting he needed a night out with grown-ups, but the envelope had sat on his dresser unopened until tonight. He didn't want crowds. He didn't want conversations. But after learning that Ethan himself had ordered the ban, the walls of his house felt too small, too heavy with silence. So he ironed a shirt, slipped on a jacket, and drove to the downtown arts center, telling himself he'd stay an hour, no more. Inside, the gala glittered with wealth, the kind of room where every handshake was a negotiation and every smile had a price tag. Harold moved quietly through the crowd, nodding politely, staying at the edges like a man passing through a dream that didn't belong to him. He had one hand around a glass of sparkling water when he heard someone call his name, not tentatively, not unsure, but with a decisive familiarity. "Harold Bennett." He turned, puzzled. A woman in an elegant navy gown approached with a confidence that softened the room around her. Silver hair swept neatly back, posture straight, eyes sharp with intelligence. He recognized her before he found her name. Judge Linda Graves. A figure whispered about in legal circles, respected in federal courts, feared by anyone who mistook arrogance for power. But what startled him wasn't who she was. It was the warmth in her expression. "I thought that was you," she said, stopping in front of him. "It's been years. You really don't remember, do you?" Harold blinked. "I'm sorry, Judge, should I?" She laughed softly. "My husband, Harold, you pulled him out of that interstate pileup. Car was crushed around him. The paramedics said he wouldn't have made it another minute." A memory snapped into focus. The twisted metal, the leaking fuel, the terrified face of a man pinned behind a collapsed dashboard. Harold felt a slow recognition settle in his chest. That was your husband. Yes, she said, voice gentle now. And you stayed with him the whole way until the helicopter arrived. You never even gave your name. I had to dig through old reports to find you afterward. She took his hand firmly, like someone finishing a sentence long overdue. I've been hoping to run into you again. For the first time in days, Harold felt something that resembled ease. Gratitude without expectation. Human warmth without strings. They talked for several minutes, about her husband's recovery, about Harold's retirement, about the charity's work. Her presence was calm, commanding, a stark contrast to the icy condescension he'd faced from the Thornton family. Eventually she insisted, "You owe me a coffee, or rather, I owe you one." Harold chuckled, "Coffee I can do." They stepped aside to a quieter corner of the hall. As conversations buzzed around them, Linda's expression sharpened, perceptive enough to see the shadow lingering behind Harold's smile. "Something's weighing on you," she said. "You have the look of a man carrying something he didn't ask for." He hesitated, unsure how much to share. He didn't want pity. He didn't want drama. But there was something about her steadiness, her authority without arrogance, that made him speak more honestly than he expected. "It's my son's wedding," he said. "I found out I'm not welcome there." Her eyebrows lifted with measured confusion. "Not welcome? Why on earth?" He explained cautiously, choosing his words with care. He didn't mention the ban list explicitly, didn't describe the photo being circulated among security, but he told her enough. Enough for her to understand the cruelty. Enough for her to see the humiliation behind the calm. Linda listened without interrupting, but with each detail her expression tightened, anger pulling at the corners of her mouth. When he finished, she let out a sharp exhale. "That," she said, "is disgraceful, and not just morally, socially, politically. It's an insult crafted by people who think power gives them permission to forget basic decency." Harold shrugged gently. "It's their day. They can do what they want." "No," she said, her voice low but fierce. "They can't do that." He looked at her, surprised by the intensity of her indignation. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "I'll be there, you know." "At the wedding?" he asked. She nodded. "Claire's parents invited me months ago. They're hoping to secure some favors with the Community Development Board. They love being seen with people who make them look important." Harold absorbed that quietly. Fate, it seemed, had a strange way of placing pieces on the board. Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Harold, you are not going to walk into that place alone." He stared at her, unsure he'd heard correctly. She smiled, not sweetly, but with the composure of a woman who understood exactly how elite circles worked, and exactly how to shatter their assumptions. "You've already walked through fire," she said. "It's time they remember that." And in that moment, something shifted around him. The first real glimpse of how the wedding day would unfold differently than anyone expected. Harold had never cared much about clothing. His firefighter years had conditioned him to think in terms of utility, fabric that wouldn't melt in heat, boots that gripped wet concrete, gloves that saved skin. But 3 days before the wedding, he found himself standing in the quiet corner of a men's boutique, staring at a row of suits that looked more expensive than anything he'd ever worn. He didn't want to look wealthy. He didn't want to impress the Thorntons. What he wanted, what he needed, was dignity. Something that made him feel like himself, but sharper, polished, unshakable. A tailor approached, helping him select a charcoal suit with a clean line and understated stitching. When Harold stepped into the fitting room and slipped it on, he barely recognized the man in the mirror. Not because the suit transformed him, but because he looked like someone preparing for a moment he had earned, not one he was begging to be included in. The tailor pinned the sleeves, nodded approvingly, and Harold nodded back, a quiet certainty forming beneath his ribs. When he returned home, Lucy was already waiting with grooming supplies laid out on the kitchen counter: scissors, a trimmer, beard oil, even a new cologne she'd bought in a burst of protective enthusiasm. "You're not going in there looking tired," she said firmly, not giving them even 1 inch to judge. Harold smiled, touched by her determination. She stood on her toes to even out the hair at his temples, then stepped back, studying him like an artist evaluating her work. "They'll wish they hadn't messed with you," she murmured. "Mom would have loved this." The mention of his late wife tightened something in his chest, but not painfully, more like a reminder of the steadiness she had once given him. He felt her presence in the room as Lucy dusted off his shoulders, trying not to cry. When they finished, he looked cleaner, sharper, but still him, still the man who had climbed ladders into burning attics, who had raised 2 children, who had endured heartbreak without ever striking back. That night his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. When he opened it, he saw Mason's name attached above the text. "Security detail updated. They will enforce the ban aggressively. Just be ready." Harold exhaled slowly, reading it twice. It wasn't fear that moved through him. It was a cold clarity. The Thorntons weren't merely excluding him. They were preparing to make a spectacle of it, to ensure he never even got close enough for anyone to question their choice. They wanted humiliation, administered at the gate like a punishment. He set the phone down, rubbing the back of his neck. Nerves whispered at the edges of his thoughts, not fear of confrontation, but fear of what Ethan had become, fear of how far his son was willing to go just to protect an image that had no room for him. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Harold received a call from Linda Graves. Her voice held that same blend of authority and warmth he had come to recognize. "My driver will pick you up at 11 sharp," she said. "And Harold, wear the new suit." He chuckled lightly, "Yes, ma'am." But then her tone shifted, becoming firm, decisive. "I need you to trust me on something," she said. "When we arrive, let them react first. Let them reveal themselves in front of everyone. People like the Thorntons operate on borrowed respect. They crumble when the crowd sees who they truly are." Harold remained silent for a moment, absorbing her strategy. He had spent his whole life trying to shield people, trying to prevent embarrassment, conflict, flame. But this was different. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about letting the truth step into the light. Linda continued, "You don't have to lift a finger. Their behavior will undo them. All you have to do is show up, calm, dignified, unshaken." He felt the words settle inside him, steadying something that had been trembling since the moment he saw his face on that ban list. She wasn't asking him to fight. She was asking him to stand, to be present, to refuse invisibility. "Let them humiliate themselves publicly," she said finally. Harold heard the confidence in her voice, the certainty of a woman who had spent her life watching powerful people destroy their own reputations with their own arrogance. And in that moment he realized something. The table had already started to turn. Not because he planned some dramatic revenge, but because the truth had allies more powerful than anger. Mason, Lucy, Linda, and the silent, watchful eyes of every guest who would witness what the Thorntons tried to hide. He ended the call and looked at the suit hanging near the doorway, still sheathed in its protective cover. He approached it slowly, brushing his hand along the fabric, imagining the moment he would walk through those gates, not alone, not ashamed, not defeated. For the first time since the nightmare began, Harold felt something rise in him that felt dangerously close to hope. And the wedding day was only one sunrise away. The morning of the wedding rose bright and cloudless, the kind of Virginia spring day that should have felt peaceful, celebratory, filled with hope. But the atmosphere around the Thornton estate carried a different weight. Luxury vehicles streamed through the winding entrance drive, sleek black sedans, glossy European SUVs, a handful of polished vintage cars meant solely to impress. Drivers rolled down their windows to confirm names, guests stepped out adjusting designer outfits, and every movement felt rehearsed, curated, expectant. The venue's manicured gardens were alive with florists making last-minute adjustments, photographers snapping behind-the-scenes moments, and servers in crisp uniforms rushing to restock champagne stations before guests even arrived. Yet beneath the glamour pulsed a tension thick enough to sense without words. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Thornton, Claire's mother, clipboard in hand, a general surveying her battlefield. She inspected each crystal vase, each imported rose bouquet, each linen fold with a severity that made vendors straighten their posture when she passed. She spoke loudly enough for nearby guests and staff to hear. "We've spared no expense. This is the kind of wedding people talk about for years. Our guest list, well, it speaks for itself." Her voice carried a pride sharpened by insecurity, like she was reminding herself as much as anyone else. Inside the bridal suite, anxiety simmered where excitement should have been. Ethan paced back and forth, tugging at his cufflinks, glancing repeatedly at the clock. He kept checking his phone, then looking toward the door, then back at the phone again as if waiting for bad news to announce itself. Finally, he approached one of the security supervisors stationed in the hallway. "Have you checked?" he whispered urgently. Is the man accounted for?" The supervisor, a stiff-backed guard with a neutral expression, nodded with clipped efficiency. "Yes, sir. All entrances have been briefed. Your father's photo is displayed at each security checkpoint. No exceptions." Ethan swallowed, relief mixing uneasily with guilt. He nodded and turned away, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. It clung to him, visible in the tightness of his jaw, in the way he kept glancing toward the windows as cars arrived. The wedding was supposed to represent his perfect new chapter, but it already felt like something cracking at the edges. Across the estate, unnoticed by most, Lucy arrived earlier than she needed to. She parked in a corner of the gravel lot and stepped out quietly, wearing a muted dress and carrying a small clutch. She didn't approach staff or family. She simply walked along the side paths as if admiring the gardens. Her real purpose was sharper. She wanted to feel the shape of the day before her father walked into it. She wanted to understand the battlefield. She passed groups of guests who assumed she was another early-arriving bridesmaid. They didn't know her, didn't recognize her as Ethan's sister. That anonymity gave her freedom to observe. She listened to conversations carried on breezes between the rose hedges. "Why so much security?" one guest whispered to another. "I heard they're expecting trouble," someone else murmured. "From who?" "No idea, but look, guards at every gate." Nervous laughter followed, though the undertone wasn't humor. It was curiosity, the kind that spreads quickly through a polished crowd and becomes its own spectacle. Lucy caught sight of a pair of guards reviewing the band photo sheet again. They held the page briefly to the light. She saw her father's face even from a distance. Her stomach tightened. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself. He won't walk in alone, she reminded herself. That truth gave her enough strength to keep moving. Inside the bridal suite, Claire stood before a full-length mirror practicing her smile. Her makeup was immaculate, her gown shimmering with beadwork that caught the morning sun like frost. Bridesmaids fluttered around her, adjusting, complimenting, smoothing the dress's silhouette. Eleanor swept into the room, announcing that dignitaries had begun arriving, senators, board members, corporate leaders. Claire lifted her chin and smirked, feeding on the attention. Then, with a sharpness meant to impress the room, she declared, "This is what happens when you marry into the right family. People like us attract a certain caliber of guest." A bridesmaid asked casually, "Is it true you needed security because someone wasn't supposed to show up?" Claire's smirk sharpened. "Oh, it's taken care of. Some people don't know their place." The words dripped with smug certainty, loud E. Enough that even the makeup artist paused mid-stroke. Ethan, standing near the window, winced, but didn't correct her. He just stared out at the arriving cars, the guards taking positions, the tightening circle of attention. The day was supposed to be perfect, but beneath the orchestration, beneath the flowers and champagne, There was a fracture running straight through the morning. Lucy, watching from outside, felt it too, a shift in the air, a tension building like the first rumble before a storm. And none of them, not Ethan, not Claire, not her mother, had any idea that Harold was already preparing to step into this world they believed they controlled. The morning glittered with luxury. But underneath, something was about to break. The ride to the Thornton estate felt longer than it was, miles stretched by silence, by the weight of everything unsaid. Harold sat beside Judge Linda Graves in the back of her black town car, the leather seats cool beneath his palms. He had dressed carefully, the charcoal suit smooth and precise, but now he kept tugging lightly at the cuff as if grounding himself. The world outside blurred past the tinted window. Rolling Virginia hills, pastel spring blooms, and somewhere ahead, a gate he had never been expected to walk through. Linda watched him from the opposite seat, composed as ever. "Breathe," she said softly. "You deserve to be seen, Harold." He forced a small exhale through his nose. "I'm not sure they see me as anything but an inconvenience." "That's not your burden," she replied. "Their blindness doesn't diminish your worth." Her tone was firm, judicial, but compassionate. She had spent decades commanding rooms filled with men who mistook money for power. Compared to them, the Thorntons were amateurs. Still, Harold's pulse beat with a dull thrum beneath his ribs. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. He'd walked into burning houses, but the idea of stepping into his son's wedding uninvited, unwanted, placed a hollow ache in his chest. The car turned a bend, and the estate came into view. Even from a distance, it radiated extravagance. Towering hedges sculpted into perfect symmetry, fountains shooting arcs of water into the warm air, and guests spilling along the entrance path in clusters of tailored suits and shimmering gowns. The moment Linda's driver slowed, heads began to turn. Linda leaned slightly toward the window. "They recognized the car," she murmured. "Good." He glanced at her. "You planned that?" She smiled. "Absolutely." The driver pulled to a stop at the foot of the stone steps leading to the venue's main entrance. A low hum rippled through the gathered guests, curiosity, then recognition. Judge Graves needed no introduction. Her reputation traveled faster than her footsteps. Harold stepped out first. For a heartbeat, the world paused. Sunlight brushed his shoulders, his polished shoes, the calm determination in his eyes. Conversations faltered as onlookers tried to place him. Then Linda emerged behind him and the murmurs sharpened. "Oh my God, that's Judge Graves. Why is she here? Who is that man with her?" Speculation bloomed like wildfire. But before Harold could take even 3 steps toward the entrance, 2 security officers moved swiftly from the side, intercepting him with precision. Their posture was rigid, rehearsed. One raised a hand toward him, signaling for him to stop. "Sir, we're going to need you to step back," the lead guard said. "Name." Harold opened his mouth to speak, but Linda's hand landed on his arm, light but commanding. She stepped forward smoothly, placing herself between Harold and the officers. "This man is my guest," she said, her voice calm but edged with unmistakable authority. "Is there an issue?" The guards exchanged tense looks. "Ma'am," the lead one began carefully, "we've been given strict instructions. He is not allowed entry. We have documentation." Linda did not let him finish. She reached into her clutch and produced a leather-bound credential case. With a practiced flick, she opened it, revealing her federal identification and judicial seal. The sunlight glinted off the emblem like a warning. "If you intend to prevent my guest from entering," she said, her voice low enough to be quiet but sharp enough to cut, "you will need to explain, in writing, why you impeded a federal judge and the person she is accompanying. And you will need to do so in front of your supervisor, your employer, and the wedding hosts." The guards froze. The second officer swallowed visibly. The lead one's jaw tightened as he stared at the badge. One challenge and his career could turn to dust. The air around them thickened. Even nearby guests who didn't understand the details felt the shift. A few stepped back instinctively, giving the confrontation space. "Ma'am," the lead officer said finally, voice subdued, we weren't aware he was with you." "You are now," Linda replied, snapping the credential case shut with a controlled snap that echoed loud. "Earthen the fountains, step aside." They obeyed immediately. The invisible barrier that had been meant to block Harold dissolved in an instant. Guests watched, wide-eyed, as the path cleared for him. Harold walked forward slowly, every movement deliberate, steady, precise. Linda matched his pace at his side, her presence a shield, her confidence a silent announcement. "This man belongs here more than any of you understand." Harold didn't feel triumphant, not yet. What he felt was something quieter, deeper, a kind of reclamation. For the first time in months, he wasn't shrinking, wasn't hiding, wasn't asking for scraps of acceptance. He simply walked, head high, through the door they had tried so hard to bar. Behind him, the guard stood motionless, unsure who to fear more, the judge, or the consequences of underestimating the man she chose to escort. Harold crossed the threshold, and the real confrontation, inevitable, unavoidable, waited just beyond the next room. The moment Harold and Judge Linda Graves stepped into the grand foyer, the room seemed to inhale at once. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. The soft clinking of champagne glasses quieted. It was as if the entire venue turned its head in a single motion, drawn not just by the entrance of a federal judge, but by the unfamiliar man walking confidently beside her. Harold felt dozens of eyes on him, curious, calculating, startled. He kept his pace steady, shoulders squared, the polished charcoal suit catching the light in dignified lines. Linda walked with the ease of someone accustomed to commanding high-profile rooms. Her presence beside him transformed the moment. She wasn't simply accompanying him, she was announcing him. Whispers rippled through the clusters of guests like wind bending tall grass. "Who is he?" "He came with Judge Graves. She never brings personal guests." "Must be someone important." Harold didn't allow himself to react, but he felt the shift, the subtle reordering of the room, the recalibration of assumptions. People who would have dismissed him at the door now watched with interest, even admiration. Across the ballroom, Ethan caught sight of him. For a heartbeat, Ethan froze, mid-conversation with the wedding coordinator. His eyes widened, disbelief collapsing into raw panic. His groom's boutonniere trembled slightly as he stepped back, bumping into a table. The coordinator asked if he was all right, but Ethan didn't answer. He was already moving, stumbling toward her with urgency. "Why is he here?" Ethan hissed. "We had him on the list. You told me he wasn't supposed to." The coordinator glanced toward the entrance and paled. "Sir, he's with Judge Linda Graves." The name alone seemed to hit Ethan like a physical blow. Meanwhile, Claire stood near the floral arch with a cluster of bridesmaids. Her expression, once poised and polished, cracked instantly when she saw Harold. Her lips parted in shock, a hand instinctively rising to her chest. It wasn't embarrassment, it was horror. A threat to her perfect image had just walked through the front door wearing a dignified suit and escorted by a woman the elite world bowed to. Behind her, Eleanor Thornton went nearly white. She clutched her pearls, literally, and whispered something sharp to a nearby planner. Whatever she said, the planner only shook her head helplessly, eyes darting toward Linda like a warning. "Don't interfere." Linda, meanwhile, moved with graceful precision through the crowd, bringing Harold into the orbit of power whether the Thorntons liked it or not. She greeted several dignitaries, local politicians, corporate executives, board members, each recognizing her immediately and straightening with respect. And every time a greeting was exchanged, Linda would gesture gently toward Harold. "This is my guest, Harold Bennett." That sentence alone carried a weight money couldn't buy. Hands extended toward Harold, faces softened, postures shifted. Within minutes, the social hierarchy of the wedding subtly rearranged itself, placing Harold near the center of gravity. Someone offered him a glass of champagne. Another commented on the honor of being introduced to him. A third said, "Any friend of Judge Graves is someone worth knowing." Harold accepted their greetings quietly, graciously, almost humbly, but inside, a quiet storm of conflicting emotions churned. He hadn't come here to be admired. He had simply come not to disappear. And yet now, disappearing was impossible. Across the room, Ethan watched helplessly as every attempt to regain control fell apart. He tried signaling a planner. He tried gesturing toward security. But no one moved. No one dared. The presence of Linda had shifted the rules of engagement, made every previous instruction obsolete. The ban list was meaningless now, a relic of hubris no one wanted to get caught enforcing. Claire, increasingly frantic, grabbed her mother's arm. "Do something," she whispered sharply. Alina whispered back, "We can't, not with H.R. here." But the most powerful moment for Harold didn't come from the fearful Thorntons or the respectful elites. It came from a familiar voice behind him. "Dad." He turned. Lucy stood there, radiant with pride, her eyes shining in a way that made the entire ordeal feel suddenly worth it. She stepped to his side without hesitation, linking her arm through his. It was a simple gesture, quiet, steady, unbroken, but it told the entire room everything they needed to know. He wasn't alone. And as guests noticed the resemblance, her smile, his posture, they whispered again, but differently this time. "That's his daughter. She looks proud of him. He must be someone significant." The Thorntons' narrative, Harold as an embarrassment, an unrefined outsider, crumbled before their eyes, replaced by something undeniable. Respect, curiosity, even admiration. Ethan, now pale and sweating, stared across the room at a reality he hadn't prepared for. Harold Bennett, the man he tried to erase, had become, by sheer grace and undeniable presence, the most respected man in the room. And the ceremony hadn't even begun. The question now wasn't whether Harold belonged. It was how much more the Thorntons would lose before the day was over. Ethan found Harold near the side corridor leading toward the reception hall, half hidden from the flow of guests, quiet except for the muffled music echoing off marble floors. His footsteps were sharp, fast, unsteady. When he reached Harold, he grabbed his arm with a force that betrayed panic more than anger. "What are you doing here?" Ethan hissed. His face was flushed, his tie crooked from anxious tugging. "You weren't supposed to come. You're ruining the optics, Dad. Do you understand that?" Harold studied him calmly, letting the accusation settle between them. The corridor light cast a faint glow across Ethan's trembling jawline, emphasizing just how shaken he was. "Optics," Harold repeated quietly, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "Is that what matters to you today, how things look?" Ethan's eyes flashed with frustration. "Yes, it matters. This is the biggest day of my life. The Thorntons have important people here. This can make or break deals, partnerships, and you showing up like this." "Like what?" Harold asked, voice steady. "In a suit, with dignity, with the same respect I've shown you your whole life." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You weren't invited. We had arrangements. You showing up with Judge Graves' dad, it makes everything complicated. People are asking questions. Claire's family is furious." Harold nodded slowly, absorbing each word, not with hurt this time, but with clarity. "I raised you better than this, Ethan." The sentence landed with a quiet finality. Ethan blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Harold didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse, didn't beg. He simply stated a truth Ethan couldn't outrun. Before Ethan could recover, heels clicked sharply across the polished floor. Claire appeared at the end of the corridor, the hem of her elaborate gown swaying behind her like a storm cloud. Her expression was tight, eyes blazing with indignation. "There you are," she snapped at Ethan. Then her glare cut to Harold, cold, slicing, practiced. "I knew it. I knew he'd make a scene." Harold didn't move. He didn't even blink. Claire stepped closer, her voice rising. "You shouldn't be here. This wedding is already on edge and you're making it worse. Honestly, Ethan, this is embarrassing." The word landed with more malice than volume, and it echoed just long enough for a few nearby guests to glance their way. Harold saw them, saw the way they stiffened, the way their expression soured not at him but at her tone. Claire continued, unbothered by the attention. "You've always been difficult," she said to Harold, waving her hand dismissively. "You don't fit into spaces like this. You never have." "Claire," Ethan's voice cracked with unease. "Stop." But she didn't. Not yet. She was too blinded by the need to control the moment, too certain the room would side with her. And then the soft click of another pair of heels approached, measured, authoritative. Judge Linda Graves stepped forward, her presence slicing clean through the tension like a polished blade. "Is something wrong here?" Linda asked, her voice low but carrying enough power to make Claire instinctively straighten. Claire opened her mouth, ready to twist the narrative, but Linda didn't give her the chance. "I heard you from across the hall," Linda continued, her tone crisp as frost, "and I believe you owe Mr. Bennett an apology." Silence spread outward from her like a shockwave. Claire blinked rapidly. "Excuse me." Linda stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "This man is a guest of mine, a respected man, and what I just witnessed," she glanced toward the growing cluster of onlookers, "was a display of astounding discourtesy." Ethan swallowed hard, color draining from his face, as whispers began to rise. People behind him. Claire stumbled over her words, searching for footing she no longer had. I didn't mean." "Intent," Linda cut in, "means little when the behavior is broadcast to half the room." Harold stood still, watching the shift, subtle, profound. For the first time, Claire's confidence faltered. For the first time, Ethan's certainty wavered. Guests edged closer, pretending to sip champagne while listening openly now. Sympathy rolled toward Harold like a quiet tide. "That's Harold Bennett," someone whispered. "He came with the judge. She's defending him." "Did you hear how the bride talked to him?" Social perception, so carefully crafted by the Thorntons, began to crumble in real time. Ethan finally looked at Harold, truly looked at him, and the panic in his eyes softened into something else, realization. He hadn't just misjudged his father. He had misjudged the entire power dynamic of the day. His attempt to erase Harold had not only failed, it had exposed his own pettiness to the very people he hoped to impress. Harold exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest lifting, not because he'd won anything, but because the truth had revealed itself without him lifting a finger. And the ceremony was still ahead. The confrontation was over. But the consequences had only begun. The ceremony space had been designed to impress, arched trellises overflowing with white roses, rows of gold-rimmed chairs, a string quartet whose music floated like polished glass in the air. Yet as guests filed in and took their seats, an unease threaded through the elegance, subtle but impossible to ignore. Conversations were quieter. Eyes darted toward Harold with curiosity and something more complicated, respect mixed with fascination. Linda guided Harold to the front row, where several dignitaries she knew were already seated. She introduced him with a gentle hand on his arm, her voice warm and authoritative, as though she were presenting a colleague of equal stature. The dignitaries rose to shake Harold's hand, offering genuine smiles and compliments on his service background, details Linda had praised earlier. Harold nodded graciously, feeling the strange duality of the moment. He remained an outsider in his son's life, yet here he was seated among people with influence, people who treated him like he belonged. He took his seat quietly, the soft cushion folding beneath him as the quartet shifted into a ceremonial melody. Lucy slipped into the row beside him, smoothing her dress as she sat. She leaned close, whispering, "You're causing a stir, Dad." Her smile was small but full of pride. When Harold glanced around, he noticed several guests offering him polite nods, recognizing him not as the man the Thorntons tried to exclude, but as someone whose presence now carried weight. Up front, Ethan stood under the floral archway beside the officiant. His posture appeared stiff, hands clasped tight in front of him. When he spotted Harold sitting among dignitaries, Ethan's throat bobbed with a swallow. His eyes flicked away, then back, then away again. The tension in his shoulders deepened, his chest rising with shallow, uneven breaths. Beside Ethan, Claire waited with forced poise. Her gown shimmered in the sunlight, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd for signs of judgment. Her mother, Eleanor, sat only 2 rows back, whispering urgently to Claire's father. Each whisper carried the same frantic note. How did he get in? Why is he seated there? Who seated him there? Who allowed this? They had believed their influence extended across the entire venue. They had believed they controlled every detail. But power, real power, was shifting right in front of them. The ceremony began. The officiant announced the union with a solemn voice, but Ethan's attention kept drifting toward Harold. Every time his eyes landed on his father standing tall among respected guests, Ethan's composure faltered. His jaw tightened. His fingers twitched. His breath hitched. Even from across the aisle, Harold saw it, the beginning of unraveling. When the officiant invited Ethan to begin his vows, a hush fell over the ceremony. Ethan inhaled shakily, unfolding the paper in his trembling hands. The microphone captured the faint tremor in his voice as he spoke the first sentence. But then his eyes lifted, drawn helplessly toward Harold again. He faltered. A murmur rippled through the audience. He cleared his throat, attempted a smile, and tried again. "Claire, when I met you," his voice cracked. He blinked rapidly, trying to regain control, but the presence of Harold, calm, dignified, unmoving, seemed to rattle him at a deeper level than even he anticipated. Claire shot him an irritated glance, quick and sharp, as though silently ordering him to pull himself together. But instead of strengthening him, the pressure made him stumble further. From their row, Lucy leaned slightly toward Harold, her expression soft with quiet understanding. "Everything's shifting," she whispered. "They're losing their grip." Behind them, several guests began whispering compliments. "That's Harold, right? The judge's guest. He carries himself well. Very dignified man." Eleanor heard it. Each word chipped at her perfect facade. She clenched her jaw so tightly her earrings trembled. Meanwhile, Linda sat poised, hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the officiant. When Ethan finally finished his shaky vow, she leaned subtly toward the officiant as he prepared the next segment. Her voice was too quiet for guests to hear, but clear enough for Harold beside her. "During the reception, I'll need a moment to make an announcement." The officiant straightened slightly, caught off guard, but nodded with the kind of compliance reserved for someone who understood they were speaking to a federal authority. Harold glanced at Linda with a flicker of concern. She merely offered a calm, confident smile, the expression of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Up front, Ethan saw the exchange, and panic bloomed behind his eyes. He swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. Whatever was coming, whatever Linda planned to say, he sensed it would unravel the image he had worked so desperately to maintain. He looked out at the rows of guests, their curious glances, their shifting sympathies, and his voice quivered again. The vows hadn't even been completed, but the facade was already beginning to crumble. The reception hall glowed with candlelight, crystal chandeliers scattering soft gold across the tables, but beneath all the elegance ran an electric tension, one that no music, no floral arrangement, no champagne fountain could hide. Guests settled into their seats with polite chatter, though many kept glancing toward Harold, curious about the quiet man who had arrived beside a federal judge and seemed to unsettle the entire Thornton family without saying a single word. Ethan sat rigid at the head table, a smile plastered onto his face like a mask cracked down the middle. Every few seconds, he tugged at his tie or reset his cufflinks, trying to appear composed. But the strain showed, lines around his eyes, a twitch in his jaw, the way his knee bounced beneath the table. A server approached to refill his water. Ethan snapped. "No, no more," he barked, sharper than necessary. The server froze, startled. "I said I'm fine." His voice wavered, too loud, too harsh for the delicate atmosphere. Several guests turned. The server nodded quickly, retreating with lowered eyes. Claire leaned toward Ethan, whispering through clenched teeth, "Stop it. People are watching." Ethan didn't reply. He just stared down at his untouched plate, breath tight, shoulders trembling with the effort to hold himself together. Claire's glare swept the room until it landed squarely on Harold. Her expression hardened instantly. "This is your fault," she muttered under her breath, each word sharp as a pin. "He was fine before you came." Harold didn't respond. He sat calmly between Lucy and Linda, posture straight, eyes lowered, neither defensive nor confrontational. But Claire's gaze lingered, burning with resentment. She needed someone to blame, and blaming her groom didn't fit the perfect wedding narrative she'd constructed. Blaming Harold, however, that came easily. Dinner progressed, though the tension built like steam trapped beneath a sealed lid. Conversations grew more hushed. The clink of silverware felt louder than usual. Even the servers moved cautiously, navigating the combustible air around the wedding couple. Finally, as plates were cleared and guests settled with fresh pours of champagne, the officiant tapped the microphone gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with formal toasts, Judge Linda Graves has requested a moment." A ripple moved through the room, surprise, curiosity, speculation. Claire stiffened visibly. Ethan's hand curled into a fist under the tablecloth. Linda rose with graceful authority, holding her flute lightly between two fingers. When she spoke, her voice carried effortlessly across the reception hall. "Before we raise our glasses to the newlyweds," she began, "I want to acknowledge something deeply important, something weddings often overlook." Her eyes swept the room, calm and commanding. True integrity, true sacrifice, and the quiet strength of people who never ask for recognition. A hush fell instantly. Harold felt Lucy shift beside him, her breath catching. Linda continued, speaking with conviction. "We are surrounded today by luxury and refinement, but none of that measures the worth of a person. Character is built in hardship, in courage, in service to others. And there is a man in this room who embodies those qualities more than anyone I know." Her gaze landed directly on Harold. Guests followed her eyes. Claire's mother stiffened, horror creeping onto her face. Linda lifted her glass to Harold Bennett. A collective murmur swept through the hall, surprise, admiration, even a few cheers. Then applause broke out. Not polite applause, genuine, earnest applause. People who had never met Harold nodded toward him with respect. A few even stood. Harold's heart beat heavily in his chest, but he didn't shrink from the attention. He simply placed a hand over his heart, acknowledging the gesture with a humility that made the applause swell even louder. At the head table, Claire's mouth fell slightly open, disbelief etched into every tense muscle. Her mother leaned close, whispering urgently, "This is humiliating, absolutely humiliating." Her cheeks flushed a furious shade of red she couldn't hide. Ethan stared at Harold as though betrayed, not by something Harold did, but by the fact that the room admired him. That the father he tried to erase was now the emotional center of the entire wedding. He leaned toward Claire, voice trembling. "She shouldn't be toasting him. This is our day." Claire snapped back. "Well, maybe if you controlled things better." But her words dissolved under the continued applause for Harold Bennett. Harold lifted his glass quietly, meeting Linda's eyes with gratitude but also with something steadier, a dignity that didn't need recognition but accepted it with grace. Guests watched him, studied his composure, his quiet strength, and the contrast between his behavior and the couple at the head table grew sharper by the second. Ethan's glare intensified, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. He looked at his father not with love, not with regret, but with a wounded pride, an ego struggling to understand how everything had turned upside down so quickly. Harold didn't return the glare. He simply raised his glass, steady and calm, offering the room a nod of gratitude, a man standing in grace under fire. And the fire, as everyone could now see, wasn't coming from him. It was coming from the couple who thought they controlled everything, until they didn't. The applause for Harold had barely settled when the tone of the entire reception began to shift, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Conversations grew tighter, more focused. Guests leaned closer to one another, their voices lower, their glances sharper as if the truth circulating beneath the surface finally demanded to be spoken aloud. Near the bar, Ethan's childhood friend, Mark Ellison, broad-shouldered, still carrying the easy familiarity of boyhood, approached him with a drink in hand. Mark had been smiling earlier, genuinely excited for his old friend. But now his expression had cooled, his brow furrowed with something closer to disappointment. "Ethan," Mark said, stepping directly into his path, "we need to talk." Ethan, still rattled from the toast, rubbed a hand across his forehead. "Not now, Mark. I've got a lot to manage." "No," Mark cut in firmly, lowering his voice but not softening it. "I just heard people talking. They're saying you banned your own father from your wedding. Is that true?" Ethan froze. Mark's eyes hardened. "I've known you since you were 7. Your dad coached your baseball team. He worked double shifts so you could go to that private school, and you did that to him." Ethan's jaw tensed. "It's complicated." "No," Mark replied, leaning in. "It's cruel." The words hit Ethan with visible force, his breath catching in his throat. Mark didn't wait for a response. He simply shook his head and walked away, leaving Ethan standing in the widening shadow of his own choices. Meanwhile, across the room, whispers were multiplying like cracks in glass. "I heard there was a ban list, with his father's photo on it. Who does that to their own parent? It's disgusting." Eleanor Thornton noticed them, small groups huddling, eyes flickering, judgments forming, and she stiffened. She tried to smile to maintain the illusion of control, but the whispers only grew thicker. Reputation, the thing she prized above all, was slipping through her fingers. At the edge of the dance floor, a group of bridesmaids clustered together. One of them, Rachel, Claire's longtime friend, leaned closer to another. "I mean, banning the father, that's shallow, even for Claire." She didn't bother whispering. The words landed loudly enough for several nearby guests to turn. Rachel's eyes widened when she realized people heard her, but instead of apologizing, she simply shrugged. "Well, it's true." It was at that moment, when rumor was seconds away from igniting into fact, that Mason Price, dressed in formal security attire, stepped into the center of the room carrying a radio. He wasn't trying to draw attention, but his voice carried farther than he realized. A colleague asked him quietly, "Is it true that man, the judge's guest, wasn't supposed to be allowed in?" Mason replied louder than he intended. "The ban came directly from the groom, not the venue, not the bride's family. Ethan Bennett himself signed the restriction." The chatter stopped. Silence spread across the room like a dropped curtain. Mason, realizing too late the radius of his voice, pressed his lips together and walked briskly away. But the damage was done. Guests looked at Ethan now with stunned disbelief, their earlier respect dissolving into something colder. Ethan felt the shift like a physical blow. His ears rang, his vision tightened. He could feel eyes on him, not admiring, not supportive, but condemning. His breath quickened, shallow and panicked. He stepped backward, bumping into a chair, then spun and pushed through the tables, heading toward the courtyard doors as fast as dignity would allow. His face burned with humiliation. The whispers followed him like a trail of smoke. Claire saw him flee and snapped her attention toward the guests, trying to read the room. It didn't take long. She saw the stares, the murmurs, the horrified expressions. She saw control slipping through her manicured fingers. Her gown swished sharply as she hurried after Ethan, heels clicking furiously across the polished floor. She caught him just outside, beneath the patio string lights that didn't reach far enough to hide his despair. "What are you doing?" she hissed, grabbing his arm. "Why did you run out like that?" Ethan spun toward her, shaken. "People know. They know about the ban. They know I had him blocked." "Well," Claire snapped, "whose fault is that? You didn't keep it quiet. You didn't manage it. You let this blow up in our faces." "My fault," Ethan echoed, incredulous. "You were the one who pushed for it." Claire's eyes flared. "Don't you dare put this on me. You're the groom. You were supposed to keep control. Now look at what's happening. Your father, is being worshipped inside while everyone thinks we're monsters." Ethan's breath shook. His collar felt too tight, his chest too small for the panic inside it. The courtyard was quiet except for the muffled music behind them and the raw, unraveling tension between bride and groom. Inside, the whispers continued. Outside, the wedding began to fracture. And the night was nowhere near its breaking point. Harold stepped outside into the cool night air, away from the hum of chatter and clinking glasses, away from the whispers that now carried Ethan's name like a warning. The courtyard lights glowed softly overhead, casting warm halos onto the stone path. But the quiet wasn't peaceful. It trembled with tension, the kind that settles only after truth has shattered something fragile. He found Ethan near the far end of the garden, half hidden behind a pillar, shoulders shaking, hands pressed against his face as if trying to hold himself together. Ethan didn't hear Harold approach until the gravel crunched under his shoes. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red, breathing uneven, pride battling raw humiliation. "What do you want?" Ethan rasped, wiping his face quickly. "Come to enjoy the show, too," he gestured vaguely toward the ballroom, "to show off some more." Harold stopped a few feet away, keeping his posture steady, refusing to let anger or pity take over. "Show off," he repeated softly. "Ethan, I didn't do anything except walk through a door." Ethan laughed bitterly, a broken sound. "You came with a federal judge, Dad. You sat up front like some kind of VIP. People were talking, staring, and then that toast." "That toast wasn't mine," Harold said gently. "I didn't ask for it." Ethan's breathing quickened. "Well, it made me look ridiculous. Do you have any idea what it did to the optics? I had everything planned, every detail, and you just stood there like you belonged more than I did." The accusation stung sharper than anything Ethan had said before, not because of the words themselves, but because Ethan believed them. Because somewhere along the line, his son had mistaken Harold's presence for an intrusion rather than a foundation. Harold straightened, letting the truth find its way into the open. "I didn't exclude myself, Ethan," he said quietly. "You did." The words hung in the air, simple, steady, undeniable. Ethan blinked rapidly as if absorbing a blow. The mask cracked. His voice fell to a thin whisper. "You wouldn't understand." "Help me," Harold said. "Make me understand." At first, Ethan shook his head, lips trembling. Then the dam that had been straining all evening finally gave way. "I was ashamed," Ethan blurted out, the confession spilling out faster than he could contain. "All right, I was ashamed. Claire's family, they're wealthy, sophisticated. They talk about their trips to Europe, their board connections, their estates. And you." He broke off, guilt choking him. Harold didn't move. He didn't rescue the silence. He let it stretch until Ethan was forced to face himself. "You live in that old house." Ethan continued, voice cracking. "You wear discount shoes. You fix your own gutters. You're simple, Dad. You're good, but you're simple. And I didn't want them looking down on me because of you. I didn't want Claire thinking I came from nothing. The confession cut deeper than any ban list ever could. Harold felt his chest tighten, not with anger but with a grief that seemed to echo from somewhere years back. From every childhood moment he'd worked extra shifts, every late-night meal he'd cooked alone, every birthday he'd saved for without complaint. All of it, all the love, the sacrifice, the quiet endurance, dismissed with a single word: ashamed. When Harold finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, but heavy with hurt. I spent 30 years running into burning buildings, Ethan. I missed birthdays, holidays, your mother's last breath because I was out saving other families. I built a life you never had to fear, a life where you were fed, clothed, educated, and you were ashamed of that. Ethan shook his head frantically. Dad, I didn't mean. You did, Harold said gently, and I heard you. Ethan's face contorted, regret forcing its way in too late. I messed up. I know I did. I didn't think it would blow up like this. I didn't think. That's right, Harold interrupted softly. You didn't think. Not about me. Not about what it would do. You only thought about appearances, about what they'd think of you. Ethan stepped closer, panic rising. Just give me a chance to fix it, please. I'll talk to people. I'll explain. Harold shook his head slowly. Some things you can't fix with explanations. Some things you sit with, feel, learn from. Ethan's breathing faltered. Dad, don't go. Harold looked at him, really looked, and for the first time saw not the grown man in a tuxedo, but a boy who had lost the compass that once pointed him home. I'm not leaving the wedding, Harold said softly, but I am stepping away from this conversation. Ethan's face crumpled. Please. But Harold gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder, not harshly, not coldly, just enough to steady the moment. We'll talk another time, he said, when you're ready to hear your own words. Then he turned and walked back toward the reception hall, each step measured, dignified. Behind him, Ethan sank onto a stone bench, elbows on his knees, head in his hands, left to sit with the consequences he had crafted with his own choices. The bridal suite, once a sanctuary of perfume, silk, and curated elegance, now rang with the sharp, piercing echoes of a meltdown that had been building all evening. The music from the reception thumped faintly through the walls, muffled and distant, but inside the suite, the atmosphere was electric with fury. Claire slammed the door behind her as Ethan stepped in, still pale and shaky from his confrontation with Harold. She didn't wait for him to speak. Her rage, suppressed for hours beneath polished smiles, erupted the moment the latch clicked. What is wrong with you? She shrieked, her voice cracking at the edges. Her perfectly curled hair trembled as she jabbed a finger toward his chest. You ruined everything. Do you hear me? Everything. Ethan staggered back, stunned. Claire. No, she snapped, cutting him off. Do Claire me. You had one job tonight: control the narrative, manage your father, keep him away from MY family, MY guests, MY image. Her voice splintered on the word image, revealing the truth she usually concealed behind poise. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't do anything. You're acting like. Claire's laugh was sharp, ugly, nothing like the carefully curated charm she displayed earlier. He'd do anything. Ethan, he showed up on the arm of a federal judge. He stole the spotlight. Guests are talking about HIM instead of us. Do you understand how humiliating that is? Ethan's anger rose, but Claire was spiraling beyond reason. He's a stain, she hissed. A stain on our wedding, on our image. Your father, your blue-collar hero, has embarrassed us in front of the most influential people we know. Behind Claire, a bridesmaid, Rachel, the same one who'd called Claire shallow earlier, stood frozen near the vanity table. She had come to check on the bride but now found herself trapped in the middle of a storm. Claire didn't notice her. Neither did Ethan. Rage had blinded them both. And then Claire made the mistake that would tilt the entire night into freefall. He never belonged here, she snarled. People like him drag families down, and you let him walk in like he was royalty." Rachel's eyes widened. She glanced toward another bridesmaid near the door. That bridesmaid had her phone in hand, recording. Not deliberately at first, perhaps, but once Claire's tirade reached full force, she didn't stop. It felt like witnessing truth being ripped open, and she knew others needed to see it. Claire's voice climbed higher. "This is our day, and he ruined it. If you had any spine, Ethan, you would have PT him out like you promised." The bridesmaid lowered her phone slowly, her face pale. She whispered to Rachel, "This is bad." Rachel nodded. They need to see who she really is. Within minutes, less than 2, really, the footage was in 3 private group chats among the bridesmaids. Another 2 minutes and it moved silently outward, shared with distant cousins, college acquaintances, vendors. Someone forwarded it to a groomsman. Someone else sent it to a coworker present at the wedding. By the 10-minute mark, half the reception had seen the clip. And people began to leave. Not dramatically, not with complaints, just quietly, choosing not to be part of a celebration soured by cruelty. Chairs scraped softly. Napkins were folded with apologetic glances. Servers exchanged uneasy looks as more guests stood and drifted toward the exits. Word spread faster than champagne bubbles. Claire calling Harold a stain. Claire blaming Ethan for not controlling his father. Claire screaming that Harold didn't belong in their world. Inside the reception hall, Harold remained seated beside Lucy and Linda. He didn't know the full details yet, but he sensed the shift. The sudden thinning of the crowd, the hush falling over conversations, the sideways glances toward the bridal suite. Linda leaned toward him, her expression wise, steady, unshaken. "It seems," she said softly, "that the truth always finds its way out, especially when arrogance tries to bury it." Harold looked at her, brows lifting slightly. Something happened. She gave a small, knowing smile. "Let me put it this way. You've stayed graceful through every insult thrown your way. They, on the other hand," she angled her head toward the murmuring crowd, "are ruining themselves without any help from you." The words settled into Harold's chest like a weight lifting instead of pressing down. He didn't feel triumph. He felt clarity, validation, a quiet confirmation that he had chosen dignity over bitterness, and the world was recognizing the difference. Lucy slipped her hand into his. "Dad," she whispered, "people are leaving, they're talking. Claire, she's losing it." Harold exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders. He nodded once deeply, not celebratory, just understanding. Some truths don't need a confrontation. Some people reveal who they are without anyone lifting a finger. And tonight, Claire Thornton had peeled off her own mask for the entire wedding to see. Harold didn't need revenge. The family was unraveling all on their own. The fallout moved through the reception like a quiet storm, soundless at first, then unmistakable in its path of damage. By the time Claire and Ethan returned from the courtyard, the energy of the room had shifted into something cold, watchful, and uncomfortably honest. Claire entered stiffly, her face tight with anger disguised as composure, but her posture faltered the moment she met her father's eyes across the room. Richard Thornton, usually controlled, polished, a man who built his empire on charm and intimidating calm, was red with fury. He moved toward her with long, purposeful strides, stopping just inches from her. "What on earth have you done?" he hissed, voice low but burning with humiliation. "Do you realize who that man is?" Claire blinked, caught off guard. "Dad." "No," he snapped, cutting her off. "Judge Graves' guest, the man she toasted in front of the entire room, and you called him a stain." He leaned closer, his voice a restrained growl. "Do you have any idea how that reflects on us?" Claire's eyes widened, not with guilt but with fear. "Dad, you don't understand. He embarrassed us." Richard's jaw tightened so sharply his teeth clicked. "No, you embarrassed us, and now the entire board knows. I've already had 3 messages from partners asking if this is the Thornton standard. Claire's breath hitched. Messages, how? The video, Richard said bluntly. It's everywhere. Her face drained of color. In a room where appearance was currency, she had just gone bankrupt. Nearby, Eleanor Thornton, still trying to project poise, felt her phone buzz repeatedly. She checked the screen with growing horror. One partner withdrew from a fundraising gala. Another pulled out of a real estate collaboration. A third respectfully postponed a long-planned joint venture. Her hands trembled as she scrolled. Every message carried the same undertone. We cannot be associated with this behavior. Eleanor's breath turned shallow. This is absurd, she whispered. They can't, they wouldn't. But they did. Across the room, the elite circle who once swarmed the Thornton family like satellites around a sun began drifting away physically and socially. Conversations paused when Claire or her parents approached. Smiles tightened. Eye contact vanished. Influence evaporated, one polite dismissal at a time. Meanwhile, Harold's table remained untouched by the chaos. Linda sat composed, Lucy relaxed at her father's side, and guests approached periodically to shake Harold's hand or thank him for attending. The room's gravitation had changed entirely, and everyone felt it. Ethan did too. He stood frozen for a long moment, watching the unraveling with wide, horrified eyes. His bride's fury, his mother-in-law's humiliation, the guests distancing themselves, the hush of gossip, it all collided into a realization that landed like a stone in his stomach. He had not just betrayed his father. He had destroyed his own foundation. Finally, with legs that seemed unwilling to obey, he walked toward Harold's table. Each step felt heavier than the last. Harold looked up as Ethan approached. His expression remained calm, polite, even but not open, not soft, and certainly not eager to soothe. "Dad," Ethan began, voice unsteady. Can we talk?" Harold set his glass down, folding his hands neatly in front of him. "I believe we said what needed to be said," he replied, gentle but immovable. Ethan flinched. I know, but everything's falling apart," and his voice cracked. "I'm sorry for all of it. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. I messed everything up." Harold nodded once, a slow, steady motion. "I appreciate the apology, but tonight is not about fixing what you broke. It's about understanding it." Before Ethan could respond, Linda rose from her seat. She didn't loom, she didn't need to. Her presence carried authority without force. "Ethan," she said calmly, "this was yours to own. Not your father's, not the venue's, not the guests'. Yours." Ethan swallowed, tears gathering. I know I made a mistake." "A mistake," Linda repeated, her tone firm, "is a wrong turn on the way to the airport. A deliberate ban placed on your own father, followed by humiliation and entitlement. That is a choice, and choices have consequences." Ethan's lips trembled. He lowered his gaze. I wanted to fit in with them. I didn't want Claire's family thinking." "That you came from humble beginnings," Linda finished for him. "That your father wasn't polished enough, dignified enough, respected enough." She tilted her head slightly. "You miscalculated, Ethan. You assumed the world admired wealth more than character, and tonight you learned otherwise." The words didn't cut, they dismantled. Ethan's composure crumbled entirely, shoulders collapsing as if the air had been knocked out of him. He covered his face with both hands, struggling not to sob in front of the room, but failing. Harold watched quietly. He felt sympathy, yes, but not enough to rewrite history in a single moment, not enough to pretend the damage wasn't real. Lucy reached across the table to squeeze Harold's hand, grounding him in dignity as the scene unfolded. Ethan dropped into the empty chair beside them, head bowed, breath shaking uncontrollably. He had finally reached the truth, the painful, necessary truth he had run from for too long. And now, with the Thornton family unraveling around him, with guests slipping away and deals collapsing like dominoes. Ethan realized the full cost of choosing image over blood. And the night wasn't done teaching him yet. Harold stepped out of the reception hall and into the cool Virginia evening, letting the door ease shut behind him. For the first time all night, the music dulled into a faint hum, distant and harmless, no longer pressing at his nerves. The air outside was crisp, cleaner than the charged atmosphere he'd just left, and it brushed against his face like a quiet reminder that the world was bigger than one broken wedding, bigger than betrayal, bigger than pain. He walked a few steps onto the stone terrace and inhaled deeply. The night carried the scent of blooming hydrangeas, soft earth, and a hint of the nearby river. Out here he could breathe. Out here he was the man they tried to humiliate. He was simply himself. A moment later, the door clicked again. Lucy stepped out, wrapped in a light shawl, her eyes glistening with the remnants of the evening's emotions. She didn't speak at first. She just walked straight into her father's arms and held him tightly, her cheek pressing against his chest. Harold closed his eyes and rested his chin lightly on her hair. The embrace didn't need words. It was everything he'd fought to preserve: love without condition, loyalty without showmanship, family without expectation. "I'm so proud of you," Lucy murmured, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "You handled all of it better than anyone could have." Harold smiled gently. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is keep standing." Lucy nodded, squeezing his hand. "And you did." As they stood together beneath the string lights, the terrace door opened again, but this time it wasn't family. One couple approached timidly, then another, then a third. Within seconds, 4 guests stood before Harold, offering warm, sincere smiles. "Mr. Bennett," a man said, adjusting his tie, "I just wanted to tell you your composure tonight was admirable, truly." Another woman added, "Most people would have made a scene, but you walked in with dignity. We respect that." "It's clear you raised your kids well," another guest said softly, "no matter what the rumors say." Harold shook each hand humbly, offering quiet thanks, not soaking in their praise but absorbing the humanity in their words. He felt grounded, seen, not by spectacle or scandal, but by character. Even more guests filtered out, some pausing to offer a nod, others stopping to thank him directly. None of them treated him like an outsider anymore. None of them looked at him with pity. Their kindness wasn't performative, it was genuine. People who had seen everything, the meltdown, the rumors, the truths, had drawn the right conclusions on their own. Lucy watched the scene with misty eyes. "You realize you're the most respected person at this wedding, right?" Harold chuckled softly. "Strange world, isn't it?" Inside the hall, through the terrace windows, the atmosphere looked different now, hollowed, thinning, fractured. Guests weren't dancing. They weren't celebrating. They were gathering their coats, exchanging uneasy glances, quietly deciding it was time to leave. And standing in the corner of that dimming room was Ethan. He wasn't crying now. He wasn't yelling. He was simply watching. His face carried the devastation of a man who had finally understood the cost of his decisions. When he spotted Harold outside, surrounded by gentle kindness, shame pulled his shoulders inward. He didn't approach. Not yet. He just looked at the father he had cast aside, now recognized by others for the strength he'd failed to see. A few feet away from Ethan stood Claire. Her posture was rigid, her expression taut with resentment she no longer tried to hide. She glared toward the terrace with a severity that chilled the air surrounding her. She saw Harold not as a man who had weathered their cruelty gracefully, but as an obstacle, a disruption, an unwelcome truth. Even now, after everything, she refused to take accountability. She refused to see her own unraveling. She refused to understand what the room already knew. The downfall was Harold's doing. It was hers. Eleanor hovered behind her daughter like a wilted shadow, clutching a champagne flute she had stopped pretending to sip. The Thornton name, the image she'd protected ruthlessly, was crumbling right in her hands. Harold didn't look back at them directly. He didn't need to. Their collapse was no longer his burden. Lucy tightened her grip on his arm. "You okay, Dad?" Harold gazed out over the lawn, the moonlight reflecting gently off the grass, the cool night holding him like a quiet embrace. "Yes," he said softly, "I am." He didn't feel triumph, not the sharp thrill of victory or revenge. What settled into his chest was quieter, warmer, a sense of peace that came not from winning, but from refusing to sink to the level of those who tried to diminish him. He had walked into the wedding on his terms. And now, as the night unraveled behind him, he realized something even more powerful. He didn't need their approval. He never had. The peace stayed with him. And the night wasn't finished yet. By the time Harold and Lucy stepped back inside from the terrace, the reception had transformed into something unrecognizable. What had begun as a meticulously curated luxury event, blooming florals, glittering chandeliers, champagne towers, now felt like a party in slow collapse. Half the tables sat half empty. Seats were pushed back, napkins abandoned. Guests drifted toward the exits in clusters, each departure quiet but decisive. The exodus wasn't subtle anymore. People left because they were insulted. Left because they were embarrassed. Left because they wanted nothing to do with a bride who screamed about stains and a groom who banned his father. A group of well-dressed women near the doors whispered as they gathered their coats. "I've never seen anything like it." The way she talked to him, unacceptable. "My husband said the judge was furious." "I don't blame her. Harold seems lovely." Harold didn't linger near them. He merely caught the tail end of their words as he moved past. He didn't take pleasure in it, but he did feel something like gravity pulling the night into alignment, truth settling where appearances had tried to hide it. Near the catering station, servers worked efficiently, but not quietly. They whispered between refilling trays and clearing half-eaten plates. "Did you hear her screaming? She called the groom's dad a stain. Who does that? I thought this was going to be the wedding of the year." "It still is, just not the way they planned." Their voices floated just above the hum of the thinning reception, unfiltered and honest in a way that only staff could be. They had seen everything, the anger, the arrogance, the unraveling behind the polished veneer. A few feet away, two wedding planners huddled in tense conversation, flipping through a binder with the frantic energy of people calculate. In damage control. They're already asking for refunds. For what? The meltdown. For reputational impact. This video is everywhere. We can't absorb that. This wasn't our failure, this was their behavior. One planner shut her binder sharply. "We need to get statements ready. They're going to blame us for the guest departures, I can feel it." Their anxiety floated into the air like a quiet alarm. The fallout was growing, spiraling, impossible to contain. At the head table, Ethan stood alone, shoulders slumped, complexion ghost pale under the soft chandelier light. He tried to smile as guests passed, offering half-hearted nods and shallow apologies. "Thanks for coming. We understand. Long night, huh?" But no one took the bait. No one stayed to comfort him. The social hierarchy he had worshipped all his life had abandoned him with brutal efficiency. He caught sight of Harold across the room. A flash of something, regret, longing, desperation crossed his face. For a moment he looked like he wanted to approach again. But as another couple exited quickly, shaking their heads, Ethan stopped short. He looked down, defeated. No charm, no wealth, no manipulation could fix what pride had destroyed. Harold watched all of this with quiet certainty. The night had already given him more answers than he ever asked for, and there was nothing left here for him, not remorse to chase, not approval to reclaim. He glanced toward Linda, who was speaking calmly with a pair of departing dignitaries. When he caught her eye, he offered a small nod, a question, a suggestion. "Is it time?" Linda read his expression instantly. She excused herself and crossed the floor toward him, her steps deliberate, her presence steady as ever. When she reached him, she lowered her voice, though the kindness in it resonated clearly. "You've done enough for one night, Harold," she said softly. "More than enough. You stayed dignified in a room determined to strip you of it." Harold dipped his head modestly. "I just didn't want to add fuel to the fire." "You didn't," Linda smiled faintly. "You stood there with grace while others exposed their own shortcomings. That takes strength and remarkable restraint." Lucy joined them, looping her arm through Harold's, her expression warm and protective. "Dad's ready to go," she said gently. Linda nodded in approval. "Then let's leave them to clean up the mess they created." As they walked toward the exit, the remaining guests parted instinctively, offering Harold parting nods, some respectful, some grateful, some quietly ashamed on the couple's behalf. Not one glared at him. He had become the moral center of a night built on pretense. Harold stepped through the doorway, the cool air brushing his face once more. The music behind him grew faint, then distant. With each step down the stone stairs, something loosened inside him, something deep, heavy, and long carried. He reached the bottom of the steps, standing beneath the soft glow of lantern light. And for the first time that entire evening, he lifted his head fully. Not with arrogance, not with triumph, but with a kind of peace that came from surviving cruelty without letting it reshape him. He walked away from the venue, surrounded by the only people who mattered, and unburdened by the ones who never deserved his loyalty in the first place. 3 days passed after the wedding, 3 quiet, reflective days where Harold returned to the rhythm of his modest home. He repaired a loose porch board, swept the driveway, cooked simple meals. But beneath those normal routines lay a steady ache, not sharp anymore, but deep. A wound learning how to breathe. On the fourth morning, as sunlight slowly stretched across the wooden floorboards of his living room, Harold heard a car pull into his driveway. Not Lucy, her car was lighter, quicker. This one hesitated, engine humming, then cutting off abruptly. Harold already knew who it was before the knock came. When he opened the door, Ethan stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, hair unkempt, eyes heavy with sleeplessness. He didn't look like a groom returning from a honeymoon. He looked like a man returning from a battlefield he'd lost. "Dad," Ethan whispered. Harold stepped aside without a word, allowing him in. Ethan walked into the living room as though afraid the walls might reject him too. He didn't sit right away. He hovered, twisting his wedding band with unsteady fingers, then finally collapsed into the armchair across from Harold, the same chair he'd sat in as a teenager after heartbreaks, failures, and late-night talks. But this time, the distance between them was heavier. "I'm sorry," Ethan said suddenly, the words erupting with desperation. "Dad, I'm so sorry." Harold sat quietly on the couch, hands folded, expression calm but unreadable. He didn't rush to comfort, didn't interrupt, didn't soften the moment. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, breath shaking. "I know you don't want to hear excuses, and I'm not here to make any. His voice cracked. "I need you to know how badly I messed up." Harold nodded faintly, letting him continue. "It wasn't just Claire," Ethan said, swallowing hard. "She pushed, yes, her family pushed. They made me feel like you didn't fit the picture, like you'd hold me back, like I needed to distance myself from anything unpolished." He winced at the word. "But I made the decision," he confessed. "I signed the ban list, I approved it. I was the one who told security not to let you in. It wasn't them, it was Claire, it was me." Harold inhaled slowly, the truth settling, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of what he already knew in his bones. Ethan lifted his head, eyes red. "I was ashamed. Not of you as a man, God, Dad, you're everything I should have been proud of, but ashamed of how other people might judge me because of where I came from." The admission landed like a stone dropping into deep water. Silent, heavy, irreversible. I chased their approval, Ethan whispered, and I threw away yours in the process. Harold didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't rescue him from the weight of his confession. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty, it was intentional. A silence that required Ethan to sit with what he'd done. Finally, Ethan broke again. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to want me in your life right now. His voice trembled. I want a chance to rebuild what I destroyed. I want to earn your respect again. Harold leaned back slightly, eyes softening but not yielding. Ethan, he said quietly, respect isn't something you earn back in one conversation. It's something you rebuild through time. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting the truth even though it stung. I understand. And trust, Harold added, isn't something you ask for, it's something you show. Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his breath uneven. So, what do we do now? Harold looked at him for a long moment, really looked. Ethan wasn't the polished corporate figure he tried to become. He wasn't the smug groom from the ceremony. He was just a son again, a flawed, humbled, deeply regretful son. I need time, Harold said gently. Time to heal, time to let things settle, time to understand what our relationship looks like from here. Ethan's lips parted as if he had more to say, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, small, hesitant, but real. I'll give you that time, he whispered, as much as you need. Harold offered a faint nod in return, not in reconciliation but in acknowledgement. Ethan rose slowly, as though carrying the weight of his choices with every step toward the door. He paused, hand on the knob, turning back one last time. His voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Dad, for everything. Harold didn't respond with forgiveness. He didn't respond with anger. He simply said, Take care, Ethan. Ethan absorbed the words, gentle, firm, final for now, and stepped outside. The door closed softly behind him. And for the first time, he understood the full weight of what he had lost and how long the road back might be. 3 quiet weeks passed after the wedding, weeks marked by reflection rather than resentment, by slow mornings, by evenings spent on the porch as spring softened into early summer. Harold filled the days with simple routines, but beneath them lived a steady hum of something deeper, healing, reclaiming, rediscovering who he was outside the shadow of his son's choices. Then came the letter. A formal invitation from the local fire department, announcing a community ceremony to honor retired first responders for lifetime service. Harold's name was printed at the top of the program. 64 years of sacrifice, courage, and unspoken resilience finally being acknowledged publicly. On the evening of the event, the community center glowed with warm lights. Cars filled the lot. Families gathered with pride. Neighbors whispered stories about lives saved, fires battled, the kind of heroic acts most people never saw. Harold stood at the entrance in a navy suit, hands folded in front of him, the slightest hint of nerves threading through his calm demeanor. He hadn't been the center of attention since the wedding, and this time the spotlight felt earned. Then the door behind him opened. Linda Graves stepped out of her car with the same composed confidence she carried everywhere. She wore a charcoal gray suit, elegant and unfussy, her presence commanding without trying to be. When she approached Harold, her smile softened. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" she said warmly. Harold shook his head, suppressing a humbled laugh. "I wasn't sure you'd want to spend another evening watching people fuss over me." Linda slipped her arm through his. "Oh, please, tonight I'm proud to." They turned toward the entrance together, and before they reached it, another familiar figure appeared. Lucy, radiant in a simple blue dress, hurried toward them with a bright smile. She wrapped an arm around her father's other side, completing the trio with effortless unity. "You look perfect, Dad," she said, squeezing his arm. "Mom would be proud, we all are." Harold placed his hand on hers, moved beyond words. Together, Linda on his left, Lucy on his right, they walked into the hall. The room buzzed instantly. Conversations paused. Heads turned, this time not out of judgment or curiosity, but admiration, respect, gratitude. Several guests stood as he entered, offering nods and warm smiles. Some clapped quietly. Others placed hands over their hearts. Harold didn't bask in it. He simply walked with steady humility, feeling the weight of their appreciation settle gently on his shoulders instead of crushing them. And then near the back of the room, he spotted Ethan. His son sat alone, hands clasped, posture small but attentive. When Harold entered, Ethan straightened, not to draw attention to himself, but because the moment demanded reverence. His eyes softened, carrying a new understanding. This was what real respect looked like. Not something crafted from wealth or prestige, but built from decades of service, character, and quiet sacrifice. Ethan didn't approach. Not yet. He simply watched, absorbing the truth he had missed for most of his adulthood. That esteem wasn't inherited or purchased. It was lived. As Harold was led to the stage, applause rose again. Warm, genuine, unforced. Linda gave his arm a gentle squeeze before stepping aside with Lucy to join the audience. Harold approached the podium, adjusting the microphone with a modest nod. He looked out over the crowd, friends, former colleagues, neighbors, everyday people whose lives had intersected with his in small but meaningful ways. When he began speaking, his voice carried the weight of years, but also the lightness of acceptance. "I spent my life walking into places most people were running out of," Harold said, "and I'd do it again in a heartbeat, not for recognition, but because community matters, family matters, not the kind you're born into necessarily, but the kind you build with your actions, your integrity, and your boundaries." Guests listened intently. Harold continued, "Forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves, not just others. It doesn't erase the past, it acknowledges it. And boundaries, well, those are what make forgiveness possible." He paused, letting the words settle. "I stand here today grateful. Grateful for the people who supported me. Grateful for second chances. Grateful for the strength it takes to walk away from those who don't value you and walk toward those who do." Lucy brushed a tear from her cheek. Linda smiled, pride visible in her eyes. Even Ethan lowered his head, absorbing every word. Harold concluded with steady calm. "In the end, I walked in with the people who valued me and left behind the ones who didn't." The room erupted in applause, loud, heartfelt, rising to the rafters. Harold stepped back from the podium, not triumphant but peaceful. This was the ending he didn't know he needed, and the beginning of the life he deserved.